What is going on, guys? Happy Tuesday. Welcome to another episode of Eat, Train, Prosper. Today is episode 191, and this is part 2 of our pre-steroid-era training protocols. So if you have not caught episode 190, which is part 1, please go back and give that a listen, as a lot of the things that we're going to talk about, you will be missing a fair amount of context on. Before we pick up part 2 of the episode, as always, Bryan, what's going on?
Yeah, I'll be brief here. One thing that I just think is relatively relevant, given kind of this conversation topic that we're approaching with the pre-steroid era training and all of that, is I last week, after kind of deep diving into all this content for this episode, this 2-part episode, I kind of have been inspired to go back to a more like physical culture style of programming for myself. So about a week and a half ago, I made the switch back to like a 3 times a week full body from the sort of abbreviated split style routine I was doing. And so kind of 2 reasons here. One, like I said, the inspiration from the deep dive into all of this information. But second, well, actually, we'll call it 3 reasons. Second, is that I was getting so sore from the leg day of my abbreviated split. I mentioned this last week in the updates that I did like 4 sets of pendulum squat for 3 reps each. So literally just like 12 total reps. And my quads were sore for 7 days. I wasn't even able to like really get the motivation and desire to train my legs again hard for 10 days. So I literally took like 9 or 10 days off after that workout. And it literally took 7 days for my legs to not be sore. And so part of that was going into the calculation of switching back to this 3 times a week full body, with the goal being to kind of just mitigate leg soreness entirely while still getting a similar weekly volume. So if we look at, what I did that prior week where I did 4 sets of 3 on the pendulum squat, now with the current setup, I'm literally, the third reason is that this is an experiment for me. So people are always asking me like, what's your next experiment after I did the 1 arm training experiment? And, before that I did my like quit marijuana experiment and all this stuff. People are like, what is your next experiment going to be? This kind of inspires me to go to 1 set per exercise 3 times a week. So literally I have 7 exercises per workout. 1 for the quads, 1 for the hams, 1 for the chest, 1 for the shoulders, 1 for the 2 for the back, because I split the back into kind of back and lats. And then some days I have some arm work in there, and then some days I don't. So it's 7 total working sets per workout done 3 times a week. Each major muscle is hit with 3 total working sets for the week. Obviously, the back and lats are getting 6, and the arms are getting 2 for the biceps, 2 for the triceps. But so far, I've done 3 of these workouts. I've gotten through 1 week of training and no leg soreness. Still getting some quality sessions in. The workouts feel hard. Probably important to note that even though it's only 1 top working set to failure for each exercise, there are about 2 or 3 kind of ramp up warm up sets for each. And the final warm up set takes me to about 4, maybe 5 RIR, depending on the movement. So it's not like it's one, like you could still say that the last warm up set is still getting me a couple effective reps, but basically it's 1 all out set, everything I can give to it. And I'm going to stick with this for a few months and kind of see how it goes. The best part so far, like I said, is really just that my legs aren't getting sore anymore. So I've been able to get my runs on the in-between days, do bikes, things like that, and not feel like my legs are a limiting factor. So my next experiment, see how it goes.
Question for you. What sort of, like, let's go through maybe the compound you have for whatever the most recent day was. Let's say what the leg compound is, what the lat movement is, and let's do like 1 pressing. What are the rep ranges that you're working
so
in?
everything's 5 to 10.
Okay.
So where on the prior split, what I was doing was the leg stuff. I was doing under 5 reps because I was, again, trying to mitigate leg soreness. I was like, if I do sets of 3, I shouldn't really get sore, but I did 4 sets of 3 and I was sore for a week. So, so it seems as if the rep number I was targeting wasn't the main culprit for why I was getting sore. It was more likely the volume that I was doing regardless of the rep range. So everything's in the 5 to 10 range. I probably err toward the lower side of that on most stuff, with maybe the higher side of that for the isolation movements. But like an example would be for quads. One day I have pendulum squat, one day I have hack squat, and one day I have leg extension. For hams, I have a 45-degree hip extension, an RDL, and a leg curl. So one of those each day. I paired the leg extension with the RDL because I figure, if you have two leg movements, one should be relatively easier than the other. Like I paired the pendulum squat with the leg curl and the 45-degree hip extension with the hack squat, which is definitely the hardest of the three. And then, yeah, for back stuff, like I said, I have the 6 exercises for back lats. So 3 of them. One is like a rear delt upper back cable row. One is a T-bar row. And then I have a pull-up. And then I also have 2 different like single arm lumbar and iliac pulls. And I can't remember what the 6th movement is for the back lats. Maybe it's just 5. But either way, the back and lats definitely getting more volume than the rest of the upper body.
Okay, one more follow-up question. How do you feel it's gone thus far with like the low reps on the leg extension and leg curl specifically, especially because of the type of leg extension you have that, flows into the plane of gravity where the shortened position is typically significantly more?
Well, it's not. That's the thing with the leg extension, leg curl machine that I have. I can manipulate the where it's hardest, like whether it's lengthened or shortened based on what size plate I put onto this like insert pin. So it basically, like you said, it's on this sort of pendulum curve where the hardest point of the movement is going to be where the weight arm crosses gravity. So by manipulating the size of the plate that I use to kind of put on that pin, it changes where the arm crosses gravity. And so both of those movements, the leg curl and the leg extension, it's hardest at about the point that's maybe 25% into the range from most lengthened.
Perfect.
So it's very much a lengthened movement. And I did 7 reps on each of those. I did a leg curl for 7 and a leg extension for 7. And those felt totally fine given the kind of lengthened nature of the setup.
Wonderful. All right. So that's such a good, I feel like, important add to that.
Yeah, I think that so one thing I note, and I'm sure you were thinking, is that on movements that are very short overloaded, it's difficult to get sufficient stimulus from just one set. And so I think that's part of why on the back work I'm doing one for the back and one for the lats, assuming there's gonna be some crossover there, is just that those movements are inherently short overloaded, meaning that you're just not going to get as much stimulus as you would from a lengthened version of a similar movement. So all the movements I'm choosing are pretty much lengthened or mid-lengthened biased. Even the cable fly that I'm doing, I'm setting up where my forearm is perpendicular to the resistance at the lengthened position. So anytime you're doing a cable movement for a single joint, or really any single joint movement, but you can, we will stick with cables. You can pretty much determine where the overload is by where your forearm gets perpendicular to the resistance. So if I'm fully stretched with my arms spread all the way out, like crucifix style, if my forearm is perpendicular to the resistance at that point of the movement, it's going to be lengthened overloaded, despite the fact that it's a cable fly, which would generally be assumed to be short.
Yeah. Very, very good additional points. I think that, like you said, if we're talking about, I don't know, I'm thinking like a cable high row or something like that. Mm-hmm. If you're going to try and do like 5 or 6 reps on that, there's so much body English that's inherently going to come into it to try and get to that short position on rep like 5 or 6. It really begs the question: is that exercise even worth doing in that rep range, sort of thing?
For sure. And then on those movements like the seated cable row that is so short overloaded, I'm able to get so many partials on that because it's so short overloaded that I just let that happen. So I think I got 7 total reps on the cable row that were full, and then I went into 5 partials. And I honestly probably could have done another 5 partials because it's so easy to begin that initial effort.
Yep. Great additional points. Anything else from you?
Nah, what do you got?
So I mean, kind of a fair bit. By the time this episode releases, the next day I will be en route to Thailand for my first show, which is exciting. I'm quite nervous, to be completely honest. My posing feels really, really good. I definitely over prepared. The person that was helping me with posing, in the final weeks, they said, I really don't think you need 2 classes, per week. And I was like, don't care. I'm happy to spend the money. Like I want to walk in there, like knowing exactly what the fuck to do and being able to do it in my sleep. So that's kind of cool. Like I said, I'm excited. Obviously we'll see what some of the, travel stuff and in, packing all the food and these sorts of things, which require a little bit of additional, how do I want to put it? Like the caution, right? With like taking food and things like that. So that, I'm very, very much so looking forward to. I'm at the point of dieting where flavors are becoming like really profound and pronounced again, which is something that I always kind of forget about. Um, and if you're, out there thinking about dieting or in the harder part of dieting, like the commitment phase, it's it's something like, I don't really have a good way to frame it. When we're always eating so much like palatable food, your palate gets kind of, how do we call it, like less refined. Everything starts to kind of like blend together because we're always tasting these like hyper sweet things and that sort of thing. But once you stop for a long enough period of time, your palate becomes pretty sensitive, maybe. Well, for example, there's this kind of, there's like 1 0 calorie like sparkling water here that you can find, and they have a lychee flavor. And now like that lychee tastes so profound. Whereas before, like I couldn't tell the difference between cherry, lychee, peach, or anything like that. And fruit too. Fruit tastes so much better once you pass like a threshold of dieting. And I'm
Yeah.
just happy that I've arrived there.
Yeah. Once you don't have any sugar in your diet or anything sweet, then sugar becomes the sweetest thing that you taste. And it really does kind of feel like uh, you're coming from, the Garden of Eden with the greatest fruit ever being dropped in your lap.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's exciting. One final thing, I was getting a little bit flat early this or in over the weekend. So we tested a refeed and it did not go well. I was instructed to have 4 sushi rolls, so about like 30 individual sushi pieces, but it was to be a middle ground between like clean sushi and like really dirty sushi. So like a little bit of tempura, some things with some of the eel sauce on top, nothing crazy, but not super, super clean, just straight like, what do we call it? Maki, like I would normally eat. And I did not feel good. Within like 20 minutes, I did not feel very good. And then I was violently awoken from my sleep in the middle of the night to run outside and vomit.
Oh man. Do you
Yeah,
think there was
and
something bad about it? Like it was just bad sushi? Or I mean, it shouldn't
it
have just
it
been from
could
overeating.
it could have been. I was, and then I couldn't sleep that night. My heart was just pounding. I was like sweating, and I just laid there like wide awake for hours, and it was the worst night of sleep I've had in easily 3 years.
That sounds
So
terrible.
yeah, so it was like, oh sweet, like I get a refeed, and then like it was about as bad as it could have been. So um that was the not fun part of it, but that was really the first like snag of my prep thus
Yeah. Well,
far.
what's the plan then going into June 7th for the show? What are you going to do as far as like building up the carb load or anything like that?
So because this is just my regional show, we're not really peaking for it. Because the peak weeks can be kind of rough on the body with like putting all of that food in loading and stuff. So we're not going to change my training or anything, except that I'll take the day before show off of training, and we're going to do a pretty modest 2 day carbohydrate load. So
Cool.
nothing really outrageous at all, which I'm honestly happy about because, like I said, this is just the kind of formality. My regional and the real, dance per se is in, which would be about 7 weeks from now, which is my pro qualifier.
Sweet. Very cool. And then have you noticed since you've been in the deficit any change in your resting heart rate?
Not down because there is like I'm on clenbuterol, which raises
Mm,
heart rate.
got it.
So yeah, if anything, it's higher. Well, not if anything, it is higher because of that. But otherwise, it would typically start going down to a pretty notable degree.
Gotcha. Yeah. I was just curious because I know that that's quite common. And I know you see that with clients too. But I had a client just report to me he's been in a deficit only for like 2 weeks at this point. And he's like, I went out and had like 2 beers. It was like a cheat day. I had a couple beers at dinner with my wife. And he's like, so I expected to wake up and have my heart rate higher because I ate more food and I had some alcohol. And he's like, I woke up and it was the lowest resting heart rate that I've had in like the last couple years. And he's like, how is that possible? With the alcohol and all that. And I'm like, I know, I think I only can attribute it to being in a deficit.
Yeah, and I mean potentially the depth of the deficit, and I don't know how much he maybe overcorrected or saved for the cheat day if he modified earlier parts of the day or something like that. But yeah, I would probably chalk that one up to a bit of an anomaly because you typically don't see the adaptations of a deficit hit in that kind of profound way in only two
Right.
weeks.
Right. No, I agree. I agree. Yeah. It's definitely been interesting. But
Yeah.
anyways.
Cool. Well, that's it on us, I believe. Let's dive back into part two of pre steroid era training protocols.
Cool. Yeah. So one of the things I wanted to just touch on, because there has been a decent amount of kind of back and forth that I've had with followers and with some other people on DMs and stuff like that since not just this episode released, because literally it's just available right now for the most part. But the day after this episode, the first one aired, I posted a kind of synopsis of training styles and contrasted them between Reeves, Grimmick, and Park, which we covered in depth in the last episode. So I put up this little graph on my Instagram. You can go check it out now. It's not a story, so it's on my main feed. And I kind of just contrasted the different volumes and training styles of those three, and got a lot of decent feedback from people. Like, we have, both you and I have really cerebral, kind of deep thinking followers. And so no one's willing to just take things at first glance. So when I post the Steve Reeves training program that we talked about last week, where he, unlike the other two guys, is doing these extremely high volume training program where it's essentially 9 sets per muscle group per workout done on a 3 times a week full body split. So you're literally talking about 60 sets or so across the entire body done 3 times a week. That's 27 sets per body part. Um, a lot of people noted, whether it's from physical culture knowledge or just kind of intuition, that it's very likely that Steve Reeves didn't just start training with that amount of volume. So important to note that routine that I pulled for Steve Reeves was from his book. And that book was written toward the tail end of his career. And so what it seems is the reality of his training is that in his early years, call it like the 1940s, he was training more typical of the other guys, where it was 3 times a week, but doing something like 3 sets per exercise or 3 sets per muscle group, however you want to kind of frame that, and done that 3 times a week. So about 9 sets per muscle group. Then one of the things we noted in the episode is that Steve Reeves really doesn't really train to failure. He doesn't really focus on progressive overload. He just kind of shows up and trains. And the reality of that is that twofold. One is that it's likely that his volume increased over time. So he potentially, instead of using progressive overload in the typical sense of adding weight, adding reps, something like that, he opted to add volume. So going from 3 sets per muscle group per session up to the 9 is likely a progression across 15 or 20 years where he potentially had maxed out his ability to progressive overload dramatically in the reps and weight category, and thus began to increase volume. So it's not as if he, was like, I don't care about progressive overload. I'm just going to increase volume. It's like at some point he had to have gotten stronger. Like even if it was this, you and I talk about the philosophical approach to progressive overload, where you don't actively try to add weight or load to the bar, but you realize that it's feeling too easy. And thus you're like, oh, well, it's too easy now, so I have to add weight or else it's going to continue to be too easy and I'm not going to be getting effective stimulus. So it's likely he peaked out his progressive overload capacity at some point in his training journey. And then from there, instead of trying to push progressive overload in the typical sense, where there could be injury risk and burnout and fatigue and all of these things, he just began to then increase volume without necessarily increasing effort as a way to kind of move the needle forward from there. So I just kind of wanted to clear that up so that anybody that, brought that up to my attention can kind of know that we're taking that into account.
Yeah. And I think that kind of goes without saying. A lot of these, what do we want to call it? A strategy, a philosophy that people develop, it is developed over time, right? If you're like Bryan, like there's things that now that you've been 25 plus years in the game, you would not do it like 20 years old because when you're learning something, your mentors, the people who teach you, like, this is the way that things go. It would be very unreasonable for a very fresh, like 18-year-old Bryan to be like, I don't think so. I'm going to do it. I think I'm going to do it this way. Like a lot of these philosophies come formed over years of experience that contribute to the creation of a philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. So yeah, it's just, Steve Reeves took a different way of trying to build on the stimulus compared to the other two guys. And I think that that's just noteworthy that there are multiple ways to skin this cat, and he chose one way and then they chose a different way. But he did likely start in a similar way of training that they did and just then decided to progress differently. So thought that was worth clearing up initially. We had a guy comment on the YouTube comments and state that he has to correct ChatGPT on math, and therefore, it would make sense that ChatGPT doesn't know about these guys' routines. I just want to clear up that we didn't take these routines from ChatGPT. I have a book from Steve Reeves that he wrote, so that's where I got a lot of that information from. And then I also have about 10 of these strength and health magazines. For anyone watching on YouTube, you can see this image of this guy from 1945. He is kind of jacked, but I wouldn't say that he has a extremely impressive physique for today's standards. But this is kind of what was considered a great physique back, 80 years ago at this point. And so a lot of the routines that I gathered for Grimmick and Park and stuff like that came from strength and health and the typical kind of York barbell routines that would appear in those magazines for those guys. And then I would kind of cross validate that with some information from ChatGPT, but I was definitely not just pinging ChatGPT to get the training methods of these guys. So I wanted to clarify that as well.
Yep.
Cool. Well, as we kind of progress through here, we want to cover rep schemes, failure and effort, and exercise selection, then kind of get into some other stuff off of there. So really quickly on rep schemes, because there's not a whole lot to say. Like most of these guys were training somewhere between the 3 and 15 rep range, and even more specifically, probably between like 5 and 12. And so if you look at the initial training routines of Reg Park, we noted that he was a big fan of the 5x5 in the early days, where he would take 2 build-up sets and then 3 sets at the same weight. And then John Grimmick was also similar in that kind of 4 to 8-ish rep range for the most part. And then Steve Reeves was much more in the like 8 to 12, 8 to 15 in the typical kind of hypertrophy. But one interesting note is that there's a lot of information out there about how Reg Park's training progressed over time. And so that 5x5 routine that we discussed last time, was full body 3 times a week, was, according to the information I found, his typical routine in his early days. So call that like the 1940s, maybe early 1950s. I'm not really sure of the specific dates. But there's a lot of information about how his training progressed out of that style as he began to get onto the movie screen and play different characters and stuff like that. And he switched his training around more to be hypertrophy based. So he switched from the 3 times a week full body to an upper lower split. And he was kind of one of the first guys, from my understanding, that did in fact begin to engage in these kind of split routines. We mentioned Vince Garanda in the last episode, and he's kind of the main guy that gets credit for using a split routine in the pre-steroid era. But Reg Park then kind of progressed into that, and he increased his volumes. So I have, here we go, Reg Park. So in his latter years, where is that on here? So he would go from his 3 times a week full body routine to this example of an upper body day, where it was incline bench for 5 sets of 6 to 8, dips for 4 sets of 10, barbell row for 4 sets of 8, pull-ups 4 sets to failure, seated dumbbell overhead press 4 sets of 8 to 10, and then curls and tricep extensions each for 4 sets of 10 to 12. So that's a significantly higher volume than he was doing before, where he was covering the entire body 3 days a week with just, one exercise of 5x5. So you can kind of see the progression there too, as his volume increased over time there, and the increase of his rep range as well, as he's trying to stick to that hypertrophy rep range more or less. Yeah. And then what do we have as far as the rep schemes? Yeah. As far as rep schemes, that more or less covers the kind of variance there, which isn't huge. As we move into failure and effort, that's one where Steve Reeves, again, is kind of different than the other guys, where Steve Reeves really put a paramount premium on not going to failure. He was really doing his best, according to the things that I read, to just avoid excessive fatigue. He believed that vitality was affected by too much fatigue from training. And I agree with that. Like I very much feel that in my soul, where on the days or the programs that I used to do where I would have high volumes of work to failure, I would feel that over the next few days with decreased energy output, mental lethargy, kind of lack of desire to even get up and move my body much throughout the day. And Steve Reeves was a huge fan of power walking. That's from his book. So he, on off days in between his weight training days, he was a big fan of getting out and like moving his body out in nature, doing power walking, getting outside, being active. And he felt as if going to failure would be a hindrance to his ability to be able to be active and move his body and have the vitality throughout kind of the rest of his week. So unlike the other two guys, he again kind of opted for those higher volumes later in his career, but also with the lower efforts so that he could mitigate fatigue. Whereas the other two guys, well, at least Reg, I think the other two guys kind of differ here a little bit, because Reg followed a beat the logbook approach with his 5x5 initially. It's like, you're bench pressing 300 pounds for 5x5, and then the next week it's 305 for 5x5, and then 310 for 5x5, really forcing weight on the bar. And Grimmick was known more for auto-regulation of his training and an approach where he would often have a heavy day, a medium day, and a light day, or alternate heavy and light days or something along those lines. He even was noted as saying that if he woke up one day and just wasn't feeling as motivated, then he would auto-regulate that day into a light day. And so this could be his auto-regulation could be effort. And oftentimes it was effort, but it oftentimes was volume too, where if he had 4 sets for something, maybe he would do 1 or 2. Or if he had 2 exercises for a muscle group, maybe he would just do 1. And so he really used a lot of that kind of auto-regulation sense and just said, hey, if I'm not feeling up to it and I'm not going to give my best effort, then I'm not going to show up and kind of waste this day of training. I'm going to make sure that I feel kind of raring, ready to go, and have that vitality ready to attack the weights if it's going to be a hard training day. And if it's not, then I'm going to let it not be so that I can save up and put my best foot forward when it's time.
I'm impressed with that. That long ago, where we're fortunate in this day and age. Like, we have a pretty solid science around progression, even though it's still notoriously debated and not agreed upon. But it's almost like back in these like 40s and 50s, these guys were so much more in tune with their physiology because there was less, what can I call it, noise of modern day life, in the, how do I want to say this, like the niceties that we're afforded in today's life, but also take us away from some of the basics of what it means to be human and understand your body a bit. But what we really have from what you just described there is kind of the few different methods that we call like deloading now, right? You have your volume deload, you have your intensity deload, which would be like a light day, and then you have the complete deload where you like take 3 to like 7 days off of training, and we've covered that at length in prior episodes. But I think it's, again, really wild that we're talking 70, 80 years ago, these guys who were kind of some of the only few notable names at the time really had these things figured out. You're muted.
Yeah, I got you. I got you. Yeah, I agree with that as well. It's, I guess that transitions well into kind of our discussion around fatigue management, um, because they all kind of are interrelated. So John Grimmick had that way of kind of auto regulating session to session, whereas it seems like some of the other guys, well, I think Grimmick probably used proper deloads as well at some point, I'm sure. But I have a section here talking about exactly how each of them kind of went about. Yeah, here we go. Intuitive autoregulation. So Grimmick was known for saying if I felt tired, I backed off. If it felt good, I trained hard. Um, and so there's a few different methods here. So the auto-regulation method was used by all of them, but Grimmick primarily known for it. So one way was reducing the weight for a week or two, dropping volume, like I said, 1 or 2 sets instead of 3 to 5, skipping a lift or an entire workout, or swapped in a variation of a movement that was less fatiguing than a prior movement that was in there. And then some of them would just take a few days off and come back stronger. And so that would, again, kind of fit into that auto regulation category of feeling really beat up, take 3 to 7 days off, come back. That's kind of like our typical deload these days. They just were like, hey, I'm tired. I think I'm going to take a few days off, focus on walking, stretching, eating well, sleeping, and then return to the program and usually felt stronger. This was kind of an approach that was famed by Steve Reeves, who strongly advocated rest and being out in nature for recovery, which I kind of mentioned, like he liked to get outside, move his body, be in nature, things like that. Also kind of makes me think of the new science that we have today, 80 years later, on circadian rhythm and the importance of like seeing light in the morning and, you know, being in touch with nature and all of this stuff. It's like these guys had it all figured out. They just didn't have the term circadian rhythm to discuss it. And then back cycling or repeating. So this is actually, it's when I saw this as a method in which people used to use this long ago, I was really surprised and impressed because this is exactly what I like to do, where you build, you reach a point where either psychologically you're losing motivation, maybe physiologically you're unable to continue to add reps or weight for a couple of weeks and you're starting to feel a little bit kind of burnout. You don't really want to go attack it in the same way. And then they would reduce weight by 10 or 15% and build back up again. So this is literally what I do. Like I talk about it now in the modern terms of saying, okay, I'll start a cycle at 4 RIR and then the next week will be 3 and then 2 and then 1 and then failure and then failure and failure and kind of go until you can't progress anymore and then kind of rinse, wash, and repeat. This is literally what they were doing back then. So if you have an example of a 300-pound bench press for 5 in the Reg Park scenario, and he's like, oh, I just can't get 305 for 5. Like I've tried a couple weeks in a row. I'm kind of over it. I can't attack this anymore. Okay, reduce the weight 15% the next week. That is 45 pounds. So you knock 45 pounds off of 300, you end up at 255. And then you just kind of build your way back up week to week until you get to 300. But at this point, because you've built this momentum in your training, you're able to get to 305 or maybe 310. And then again, you hit a wall, you back off, you build back up. They called this back cycling or repeating a wave. Really, my preferred way of dealing with fatigue is this. I mean, I think all of them have validity. Like taking 3 to 7 days off is great. Knocking a couple sets off is great. Like there's obviously a number of different ways you can skin the cat. But I think my favorite, the one that speaks to me the most is this one of, you know, reaching a point of fatigue, can't progress anymore, back the weights off, build momentum, build back up again. What do you think of kind of those different approaches to managing fatigue?
I mean, I think they're all effective. I think which ones resonate most with you comes down a lot to your psychology, right? And I hate that I keep bringing it back to this, but I really do. For example, I really prefer the taking 3 to 7 days off, right? Mm-hmm. I'm not going to go to the gym. I'm going to walk. I'm going to maybe take a nap. Maybe I do some like sauna or hot bath instead or something like that and just not do any training. The reason I like that is I like to treat the gym like a place I go in and I work really, really hard, right? And it's hard for me to go in there and go at 70%. it's hard because it feels like I'm wasting my time going through the motions because I'm
Mhm.
definitely not getting better and I'm not putting in an effort. I'm not saying that that's right for everyone, but that's just how I personally do it. And I know, and I've had really good prior experience where I take like 4 days off, I come back and I get like 3 extra reps on the leg extension. And I'm like, holy shit. That's pretty telling right there that there was just an accumulation of fatigue. We dissipate some of that, we take some time away, and now we have a brand new training performance,
Mhm.
best.
Yeah. No, I mean that makes total sense. So when you would come back from those 3 to 7 days off, you're jumping right back in at basically like, hey, this was my failure point before I took the time off, and I'm gonna basically go right to failure again.
I mean, typically, yes, depending on the exercise. So as you were explaining, that one that came to mind is like I've been pretty stalled on my hammer strength incline press for 3 straight weeks, getting identical reps on my top set and my back off. Um, one thing that we think I could do is I could like swap the exercise. I really don't want to go to like a barbell incline at this point, in my prep. I really don't want to go to like a heavy dumbbell incline either because those are both considerably more fatiguing movements. Um, I could, work load. I could drop load like 15% and then just, potentially push into higher rep ranges or just leave the rep ranges the same, leave a lot more RIR. Maybe that's something that I'll make a note on and do. I remember when I used to train a lot more for strength, and this is just, again, Aaron's opinion and my experiences. I'm not saying it's right. I remember multiple times using that example of like, okay, I'm topped out on my 5x5 at 305. I'm going to take whatever, I'm going to reload to 275 or 240, 255, whatever, and work back up again. And then I would get stuck at the 305 again. And that would be incredibly frustrating for me because it would feel like I've just wasted 6 weeks reducing this just to get stuck in the exact same place.
Mhm.
And I had experienced that multiple times. And who knows? It could be because back then I didn't know enough about recovery, sleep, fueling adequately. There's a myriad of other confounding variables, but I just know I don't have a good track record of that in the past.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I feel like you kind of alluded to it really just comes down to personal preference and which way works best, which I think also is the case when it comes to progression models. So the progression models they used back then, really not so different than the progression models we use today. So the main kind of typical one is linear progression with a double progression. Very simple, right? This was very something that I think mostly across the board, this was the most popular. So, for example, you have 3 sets of 8 to 12 reps. You can start at 3x8 with 70 pounds, then you work your way up to 3x10 with 70 pounds, and eventually you get to 3x12 with 70 pounds. And then you hit all the sets of 12. That tells you it's time to increase the weight. You go up to 75 pounds, you drop back to 3x8 or whatever, and kind of work your way back up again. Pretty simple, works pretty well, has kind of a built in model of flushing some fatigue because if you were doing a 3x12 at 70 pounds, for example, and then you go up to 75 and drop back to 3x8, it's very likely that that 3x8 is not the most you can do with 75 pounds. It's likely that that feels easier than the 3x12 did with 70 pounds. But as you kind of build back up over a number of weeks, it's kind of like you have like a relatively easy week, then you add some reps and you have a moderate week, and then you have like a really hard to failure week. And then assuming you hit all your reps, back it off again and repeat. So it's kind of like these little 3 or 4 week mini cycles where you're backing off, building back up, backing off, building back up. And over time, I'm sure you reach a point where it's not that easy, where you don't actually hit your 3x12. So then you have to sit there for a couple weeks and maybe you go 12, 11, 9 or 12, 10, 8 or something like that. And you're like, okay, well, the next week I'm going to try to go 12, 10, 10, then 12, 11, 10, then 12, 11, 11. And like eventually over a few weeks, you're hammering, you're building fatigue, of course, but then eventually you get that 3x12 and you kind of earn that ability to back the weights off, get a little bit of recovery and build back up again.
Yeah.
Pretty popular method there. I think one of the mistakes that people make in this method, though, is never giving themselves any sort of back off. So think of an example. I see this all the time with clients. So they hit their 3x12 at 70 pounds, say, and then they up it to 75 pounds. But instead of backing the reps off, they're just like, cool, 75 pounds, 3 sets to failure, let's go. So maybe it's 12, 11, 10. And so they never actually back off to 8 to 10 reps with that weight. They're still trying to get 12s. And so every week becomes butting up against failure. And that can work, but that potentially could lead to some of the same problems with burnout, fatigue, the need to manage fatigue in a different way.
Yep. Very, very well put.
Yeah. So then straight weight linear progression is kind of what Reg Park was known for with his 5x5. And we talked about that, which is basically, you have that 300 pounds for 5, and then you try to get 305 for 5, and then 310 for 5. And maybe you end up with like 544 or 543, and you stick with the same weight and you work back up until you get that 5x5. But once you hit the 5x5, now you're adding weight again. Kind of has some elements of the double progression method as well, but with a lower rep range and maybe a slightly different approach where you're likely going to get a number of weeks in a row where you hit your 555 before, whereas in the double progression method, you hit the 12 and then in theory you back off a little bit and build back up again. This one, you kind of hit the top weight for 3x5. And then the next week you're like, cool, I made the 3x5, add some more weight, try to hit 3x5 again, deal with the fatigue when it comes. And exactly. Yeah. And then the final one, which is the John Grimmick model, is instinctive progression. And so he literally I've read that he just didn't concern himself so much with the logbook, with the exact weights or reps. He just kind of believed that if you go in and train hard and you add weight or reps when possible, back off when feeling fatigued, that eventually you just kind of, get the stimulus that you need. And I think this actually sort of is the way in which you're doing it. Not exactly like you're using a mix of methods, but the fact that, you got in, you're like, okay, I've been stuck at this weight for a few weeks. I'm just going to back off for a week, take a few days off, whatever it is, 3 to 7 days off, come back, keep trying to progress forward. So not backing off and then building forward, but being like, okay, I feel fatigued. I did my 300 for 5 or 7 or whatever it is, but I feel very fatigued. Next session or next 2 sessions, take the days off, or in his case, maybe just train less hard. And then when you come back, you're not building back up. You're just like, okay, I hit 300 by 5 last time. Now I feel good again. So I'm going to try to beat that 300 by 5.
As long as joints and stuff feel good, yeah, I will do this. Because then I find it's a pretty good tell if you were just maxed out on fatigue and you needed that reduction. Like if I have a performance increase, it's a pretty good indicator that I had fatigue masking my fitness. We flush that fatigue, I improve my fitness.
Yep. And then the last one is the volume progression. So this was more kind of what we alluded to in the beginning with Steve Reeves, potentially how he started with more like 3 sets per exercise, or 3 sets per muscle group per day, and then kind of progressed over time up to doing 9 sets per muscle group per day potentially. And that was just a result of a way to I don't know if I call it progressive overload, but it's a way of progressing. It does increase mechanical tension. And then I think the last thing to touch on here is just exercise selection. So what we found with Reg Park and Grimmick is that they really did tend to stick mostly to these big compound movements, at least in the early years in the 1940s and stuff. As you saw with Reg Park's example that I posted, where when he switched to an upper lower split, you did see kind of some more isolation stuff in there with his curls and tricep extensions and things like that. But Steve Reeves is definitely the one that used more isolated movements, it seems, than the other two. Likely a result of the amount of volume he was doing. So, but he was known for, having bent over lateral raises and a lot dumbbell flies, and a lot of those kind of like he did like, leg curls with partner assisted leg curls, which I find so interesting. I don't even know, like you're not concerned with progression when you're doing a partner assisted leg curl. You're just trying to get a stimulus. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, he used a lot more of that type of stuff. And so in that way, he was also a little bit different than the other guys.
I also think like this is something, that I brought up in last week's episode. There was just there was not as many exercises back then to do, right? So you were a little bit limited in that. And I think that also kind of lends itself to some of the, what do we call it, maybe rudimentary approach in autoregulation and those sorts of things, because right now we know like, hey, I can't progress whatever this specific incline machine at the gym. Maybe I'm going to switch to this one, which has a converging, angle now, as opposed to the other one that doesn't converge. There are these kind of more sophisticated,
Nuanced, or that's a good
nuance.
word.
Whereas
Yeah,
like
yeah,
if the options like overhead press, dips, those are your pressing options. You're a little bit limited in what you can really do. So that's where maybe the back off approach is, because it's, your tool is a hammer. You can only use it so many ways, kind of.
yep. No, I totally agree with that. Okay, so as we kind of finish up this section here, I have two additional things just to throw at you. So John McCollum, who wrote the book, the Keys to Progress, he, I mentioned in the last episode, basically the Keys to Progress is a series of articles from Strength and Health magazine over a decade or whatever. And he took these articles that were written in each issue of the magazine and basically turned them into a book by putting them in an order, from novice all the way through. And one of the interesting things in the book is that he has this kind of initial starter routine, and it's about as typical and bland and basic as you could get with a routine. And he states one of those things that you would always hear from this era, which is, until you can back squat 315 for 20, you stick with this routine. And that was always what they said. And I remember, reading that in my early years and being like, yeah, totally, like 315 for 20, I'll get there, and then I'll move on to the next routine. And then I never got there. Like, I, even to this day, like the best ever 20 rep squat I ever did, I think, was 300 or 305. I never actually made it to 315.
I think I did 325 or 335 once.
That's
But
impressive.
I could be really off too. I feel like I did that, but it could realistically have been like 265. So take that with a giant grain of salt. I mean,
Yeah.
we're going back like 2013, I think,
Yeah,
is
when
when
you were
we were
doing like
doing this.
Smolov and stuff. Yeah,
Yeah.
I remember you like really struggling to squat 5 at 365 at some point. And I don't know if you progressed past
Mhm.
that, because I know after you left CFPB, you went and did like a more strength-based program at the other gym. So it's possible that you exceeded that 365 for 5 at some point. But I remember watching that at CFPB and being like, yeah, that was about your max effort at that point.
Yeah. When we put it that way, I don't think I ever got there. I think it was probably like 285, 275 somewhere was my max.
Yeah, so I was at like, I think 300 was my best, and that was low bar, like literally, as a typical 20 rep squat is, like the first 5 or 6 reps move okay, and then the last 14 are basically like a 1 rep max every single time, where you're just like standing at the top with the bar on your back. So this routine that John McCollum promotes, until you can back squat 315 for 20, it has the 20 rep squat in it, and then it basically has like 2 or 3 sets of behind the neck press, 2 or 3 sets of dips, 2 or 3 sets of row or pull up, 2 or 3 sets of barbell curls, and some assistance stuff, for like calves and abs and whatever. But more or less, that was just the routine. And he's like, you stick with this routine until you can do 315 for 20, and then you're able to move on to the next routine. That first routine took up like 8 pages of a 200-page book. So then there's like all of these routines that follow. But I think it's really interesting and kind of demotivating that all of these old magazines and information about this era say things like that, like stick with this routine until you can hit 315 for 20, because being able to do 315 for 20 on a back squat is so far above average that like the number of people that I think read that and ever reached a point where they could do that, it's probably 1%. I mean, I can't imagine it's much higher than that.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of those things, like you're either built for it or you're not, or you're somewhere in the middle where you can probably get to it with an insane amount of a very above average amount of like willpower and dedication. But it's a very strong gate to keep, knowing that there's people who have limbs lengths that are just incredibly unfavorable for that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, it's very it's kind of putting people into a box and being like, look, everybody has to be able to squat this, or else you can never leave this routine. And so that's one of the things that I really don't like about this era. Like, if there's one main thing that to me like really grinds me the wrong way, it's statements like that. Like you should stick with this routine until. And it's like really you want people just sticking with that routine like potentially forever because they're never going to reach that point. It really takes a lot of the like fun, excitement, personal learning, adventure, like all of the exploration side of training and experimentation. It just eliminates all of that and says, you just stick with these basic movements until you strong. And I don't know, like it just doesn't vibe with me super well. And like that's how I trained for like 3 years. That's more or less what I did. And it just never got me to 315 for 20. In fact, I mean, when I did that, I was between 15 and 18 years old. So I don't think I ever even got above 255 for 20, maybe at that point, maybe 245, 235, something like that. And it wasn't until the CrossFit years that I even got up close to 300 for the 20. So yeah, I mean, that was 15 years into my training journey, and it had a number of different training styles across the way that kind of got me to that point. And I don't know that I would have made it. I don't think I would have stuck with training if literally I was being told if I was in some bizarro world where you literally couldn't change from this training routine until you hit 315 for 20. And I'm still at this point, 27 years into training, and I'm still on that routine. I would have quit. Like there's just no way. So yeah, anyway, that's my biggest problem with that era.
Yeah. And I wonder if things have changed from that, or if we're just don't really find ourselves in those circles anymore. Because I would say, when I was in high school, so let's call it the, early 2000s, that was still like a lot of verbiage and stuff we used was very similar to that. We would follow rules blindly, which really made no sense whatsoever. Like one of the things that we did dips 6 days per week.
Right. I remember you telling me that.
There's no good fucking rationale for that. But they made us do dips every single day.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's crazy. But you did get strong at them. Like that was something you got really strong at. And who's to say if it's genetics or it's because of all the dips you did, but your triceps are insane. Like your triceps are one of your best body parts. So I don't know. What is that one? How do you explain that?
It probably was all the dips. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyways, that's more or less all I have on kind of the basic background for pre-steroid era. I know we wanted to touch a bit on Nautilus. So Nautilus is a type of machine that was invented by Arthur Jones it was popularized in the 70s, but I feel like it was invented before that.
68 or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And Nautilus actually used what would to this day be described as an abbreviated training program, but it was quite different than the way that these prior programs were done by these guys that we've been discussing, or the Strength and Health magazine, or John McCollum, or anything like that. The Nautilus model, to the best of my knowledge, was basically one set per exercise with 8 to 12 different exercises across a training session, and done almost in complete succession with extremely short rest between each of them. So in a sense, it almost became this like metabolic based circuit, because like one of the typical routines would have you go from leg extension to failure with forced reps, directly into leg press with partner forced reps, and then directly into leg curl or something. So you'd have these 3 leg exercises back to back to back with no break, all of them to failure with forced reps. And then that's just the beginning. That's 3 of your 8 to 12 exercises. So then you have like a chest movement directly into a back movement, directly into a shoulder movement, directly into another back movement, directly into an arm, bicep, into a tricep, into a calf, into an ab, and boom, you have your like 8 to 12 exercises, all done to failure, all done for one set, all done with forced reps. And you would do that 3 times a week. And that was literally kind of like the Nautilus approach, to my best understanding of it. I mean, I'm sure that over the years it evolved and there were different approaches for different athletes and all that, but this is kind of the common knowledge Nautilus program, to the best of my knowledge.
Yeah. I don't have too much sophisticated knowledge on the actual programs from like Arthur Jones, but just the level of sophistication of the Gen 1 and Gen 2 Nautilus equipment was literally light years ahead of its time. And the thing that's so wild to me is Nautilus was only like this short period in Arthur Jones' life. Like fitness and like bodybuilding was like a chapter of his life. He had all these different entrepreneurial exploits and different continents and all of these things. And to be like, oh, I'm going to get into this, get it so right as like one of the first people to ever do it. It's really kind of mind blowing. And the thing that's really interesting is if you're like, going to Google some of the early Nautilus machines that have the like, they're a lot of them are chain driven, but the Nautilus cam, it's, what would you call it? Oblong shaped or
Oval. It's like an oval as opposed to a
yes,
circle. Yeah.
yes. And it's oval because it matches the strength curve or the resistance profile of the machine to the strength curve of the muscle. Right. So this is something that he was able to understand. We're talking about the late 60s, early 70s. This information was already like the first machines had this. And then for 60, 70 years after, we've made machines significantly worse. Like,
Yeah.
which is so hard to wrap your head around. And there's some machines that if you're ever in a gym, if you're ever training in like one of these old school gyms and they have one, please use it. Amazing how good they still function. They're still typically very, very usable. The stacks on them are very, very heavy. And we're talking about something that was made, what's that, 20 some years before I was even born.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm almost 40. It's wild. The one that you mentioned around one of the supersets is a leg extension into a leg press. Have you seen that machine? It has a big, like it's basically like this big leg extension, but then it has like this rail and frame. It looks almost like a big motorcycle kind of engine or frame that comes around, and then the leg press is in front of you, and there's like a switch to like move the leg press foot platform out of the way. So you literally go from like seated on the leg extension to bring the platform down. You don't even get off the machine and then do the leg press. It is so gnarly. It's so cool to see. I mean, the thing is the size of probably like a small pickup truck. It's absolutely gigantic machine, but they were so dialed in so long ago. It's so impressive to look back on history with these. So like I was saying, if you guys ever come across one, a lot of them are in the original color was like a light blue, like almost like a teal, blue. Please try them. They're very, very well made, especially considering, how old they actually are.
Yeah, no, totally. And I'm looking at the I haven't seen the leg press. Couldn't find it. I was just Googling it as you were talking.
I'll
But
try and send it to you after.
okay, cool. But what are the things that came out of Nautilus that was unique is the pullover machine. And so
Mhm.
this is one that like literally didn't really exist prior to Nautilus as far as I know. And it's the kind of one where, you're seated, there's like a seatbelt on you, you rest your elbows on a pad and you get that like full lat stretch up at the top. And then the whole movement is driven by this like circular motion where the elbows drive forward and then down and back. So you're getting a lot of humeral depression in there for the lats. And it's very different than the effect that you get from doing like a dumbbell pullover or even a cable pullover. Like I think cable pullover gets you the closest to that, the way that you see some people set up where they're on like an incline bench, lean back, and the cable's coming from like behind them. And they're kind of trying to emulate what the Nautilus pullover was, but with a cable. The way that you were in that machine with the seatbelt on and the triceps and forearms pressing against the little pad, it just creates this like optimal environment to be able to isolate the lats in a way that you just weren't able to do prior to this. And you even, at these days, you have people talking about how the pullover isn't actually even a lat exercise when done with a dumbbell. It's more of like a teres type exercise, which I agree with. But with this movement, with the pullover, you're getting that full range of motion and the humeral depression where there's stimulus. The problem with the dumbbell pullover is you lose stimulus when it's over your face, but the lats are actually going to be most active as basically the upper arm, the humerus kind of depresses and comes down, you miss that entire portion of the range of motion with the dumbbell pullover because there's no resistance there. But with this machine, you're able to get that resistance. So that was known as like the premier lat builder in those days. And whenever I get a chance to use that machine, like I'll go to Armbrust's gym in Denver. Sometimes I'll drop in and they have that machine, and I just love it. Like it's so unique, and you really feel like you're part of physical culture when you're using it.
Yeah. The only final other Nautilus lore that I had is, I forget if it's Arthur Jones' son or one of his sons then went on to create Hammer Strength. So pretty wild that like two of the legendary, let's call it American, fitness brands were father and son. And then what I also find, this is me kind of chatting shit a little bit, also funny, is a lot of the Hammer Strength kit is literally worse than the Nautilus, even though it was created 30 years later. So, hey, you can't win them all. And, sometimes you just can't fill your father's shoes, and that happens sometimes. So,
yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah. Nautilus was certainly unique, and it really was the catalyst that changed the entire way in which people train. I mean, the ubiquity of having machines around, where they were around, like we talked about prior, like, in the very first episode, we talked about how Hackenschmidt invented this version of the hack squat back in like the 1930s or something. And then there were the occasional cable or pulley machine that existed in the 30s and 40s, but nobody really used them in their training regularly. It was just kind of like this freak thing, like almost like a circus show, to be like, oh, look at this pulley machine here. And now through Nautilus and then going forward, it created a culture around the use of machines. And I think in many ways that's great. And I think in some ways it's probably not great, because you have a lot of guys coming in brand new to training that find themselves wanting to just use machines because you're seated or you're lying and it's comfortable and it tells you how you're supposed to press or pull, and you don't have to do much thinking or manipulation of movement patterns. It's just like right there for you. But I think that a lot of that also kind of allows people to use training methods that maybe are less effective than they would be if they had used some of these prior methods. And so I don't want to get on this high horse and say, until you can squat 315 for 20, you just stick with barbell back squats. But like at the same time, there's probably some benefit in starting your training career with big, compound, hard-hitting movements before succumbing to using machines and isolating and things like that.
Yeah, I don't have too much of it's not something I've really sat and thought about, so I'm not going to try to speak about it much. But one thing I will say, I do think there is benefit in embarking on a strength focused portion of your lifting career. And that's typically going to expose you to some form of a heavy deadlift, a squat, incline barbell bench press, like these sorts of things. Even if it's a, I don't know, 6 to 8 month stint, I think it's a worthwhile endeavor, especially because it's a lot of the fun parts. You're going to be getting stronger regularly, number go up, feels good, those sorts of things. So a worthwhile side quest on your mission for maximum muscle size, perhaps.
Yeah, for sure. And then the kind of the last thing I want to close on here is after the influx of steroid era, or call it golden era, because I think back in the 40s and 50s you'd call that bronze era, and then silver era. Golden era is more like Menser and Arnold, and kind of even into the 90s, maybe beginning like late 80s into the 90s, you kind of have the golden era where steroids really became prevalent, and you had the mass monsters. That was like the term they used to describe them, because they were just so much bigger than people were in prior generations. You had a lot of people in the 90s, which is when I started, getting their start in training through fitness magazines. So it was like Muscle and Fitness and Flex magazine and Muscle Development and all of these different mags. And the routines in there were, as many of you know, these body part split, bro splits, where you're doing 20 to 30 sets of chest on Monday and then 20 to 30 sets of back on Tuesday, and basically just one muscle group a day across the week. As a kind of reframing or a journey back in time, one of the guys that I learned from initially through his books was a guy named Stuart McRobert, and he wrote a book called Brawn. I think it was either in the late 80s or early 90s. And then he came out with Beyond Brawn, which was kind of the subsequent one in the 90s. That's the one that I read. And so this is kind of a way of going back to the roots of training, but not in the exact way that the people did in the 40s that we talked about for the last two episodes. This was more of the current term being the abbreviated approach, but it's essentially a focus on big compound movements done with lower volumes, done infrequently, 2 to 3 times a week on a full body program. And so it seemed like a lot of that training style got lost in, call it, the late 70s, 80s, 90s. And so with the Stuart McRobert book, Beyond Brawn, I think it brought a lot of the attention back to kind of what would be basic training methods. Not exactly like they were back in the day, a kind of renewed version of it with just the focus on the basics. And I credit a lot of my understanding and the way that I got started in general to that style of training, especially because when I first started between 15 and 18 years old, it's not like training was my life. It was meant to accommodate my basketball and the other sports that I was playing and being a teenager. And so I wouldn't have done great if I thought that I had to go in and do 20 to 30 sets of a single muscle group 6 days a week. That wouldn't have worked with my life so well. But finding Stuart McRobert, falling into the abbreviated training kind of regime online, finding some other people that had a similar approach, was really productive for me, and something that, like, to this day is I still romanticize. And that's why you see me kind of still experimenting with my training in a lot of these manners, because that training was effective back in the day when training wasn't my main focus. And now, as I'm getting into more cardio and being a dad and all the other things that come on with life, it's been really rejuvenating to kind of go back to some of my roots of training with this style.
I do agree with that. I think there's something, I like the term that you use, romanticized, about that. The way that I kind of picture it's just like that blue collar dad just lifting in the garage. You know what I mean? And like dusty old rusty equipment, like barbell dips. He's a pretty thick dude. He's pretty jacked, and he just like does the basics really, really hard and really well. And he's got those, like, his hands are like the size of a catcher's mitt sort of thing. Like that's what I imagine in my head. And there's definitely, I would also picture he has like a mullet and it's the 80s and that sort of thing. But it's very much so like a, like when I'm a kid, you know, if there's some dad who's big, like that's what I would imagine, right? So I do think there's some like something to romanticize about that perceived figure in that training methodology of just being really big and strong at the basics. Really good example. Do you follow Tom Haviland on Instagram? He's this giant Australian dude who's like almost like a mythical lore of like a Bigfoot sort of thing. The dude's like 6'8" or something like that, well over 300 pounds. He's on gear. But like you never see his face, but he just like trains out in the bush and has all this like wild welded equipment. He's an absolute monster. And he just trains on like farmer's carries, barbell squats, but he is huge.
Yep, I see him.
That's like very picturesque of what I think about with just you have your barbells, you know, in your basics, and you just get brutally strong at them, and it is effective. Rudimentary, but can be wildly effective as long as you stay nose to the grind.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to add to that, because I fully agree, is that a lot of these guys that just train on the basics in the garage, going hard on compound movements, they tend to be like a little more portly. Like they're not super lean. They're just like these big, strong guys. But I'm pretty confident in saying that if those guys decided to shred down and like stand on stage for some reason, which is super anti of everything they stand for, but like if they were to do that, I'm guessing they have plenty of muscle underneath there and that they would look pretty damn good on stage. I mean, it may point out, you know, you have a weakness here, or like this is underdeveloped or whatever. Like, sure, you're not trying to be the best bodybuilder in the world, but as far as being impressive and looking jacked, if they got lean, most people would be very, very impressed with what's underneath there. And these guys are not doing a typical bodybuilding style routine, trying to isolate each muscle or anything like that.
Agreed. Very,
Yeah.
very agreed.
Cool. Well, that's all I got.
Cool. So that is a wrap on our part 2 pre-steroid era training protocols. This one was really, really fun to dig back through some of the history of how we got here and how little things actually change in what is most important along the way, which is potentially disheartening a little bit, but very, very fun episodes. Big thank you to Bryan for structuring a lot of this. And any questions, ping us on YouTube or Instagram, or drop us a comment on YouTube or ping us on Instagram. And if we have an easier topic, maybe next week, but I might need like 2 weeks off with, I travel like Wednesday morning for next week. So
yeah, we can either do a Q&A or just take the week off.
Yep. Oh, sounds good. All right, guys, as always, thank you for listening. We'll talk to you very soon.